Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this virtual professional development opportunity. My name is Joe Schmidt, and I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the Maine Department of Education. We are welcoming back for our third time this afternoon, ThinkerAnalytix, where we have Nate Odie and Aiden Castigian, who are going to be here today to talk about, now I've lost the intellectual charity. I wanted to say curiosity. No, that was right. Intellectual charity. In previous sessions, we've been introduced to some of the available online resources from ThinkerAnalytix. I know that they're going to talk to you today about some summer learning opportunities that you can participate in if you want to learn more. We've done some argument mapping, and today we're going to think about another way in which we can approach thinking and arguing and how we interact with one another. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Nate and Aiden.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Joe. Thanks for having us in, and good to sort of see you guys. Good to be seen. Good to visit Maine. I hope it's as lovely there as it is here in Boston today. So yeah, I'm Nate Odie. I'm a fellow in Harvard's philosophy department, lead instructor for ThinkerAnalytix. I'm joined by my colleague, Aiden Castigian, program director and professor of philosophy at Wheaton College in Western Massachusetts. So the plan for today, guys, is I'm going to walk you through a skill that we call intellectual charity that we are going to use to help students discuss difficult or controversial issues and point you to some resources that we use to help students develop those skills. And then Aiden's going to introduce you to an activity called the Disagreement Project, which you can use to kind of deploy those skills. And it's really accessible for, middle school and high school students. And hopefully along the way, we're going to ask you guys a couple of questions because we genuinely want your feedback and your input because we're still kind of work in progress. So think of yourselves as a bit of a focus group for us today as well, hopefully, because we really want to know. We really want to make stuff that's actually useful to real teachers in the real world. And so we want to make sure that this is actually aligning with what you guys are looking for. So I'm just going to hop right in here, but please feel free to drop questions in the chat or, to raise your hand or just interrupt me as we go. And I will actually at certain points pause and ask you guys to share what you're thinking about something. So yeah, so there's this thing called intellectual charity, and hopefully you guys are in the right place. Let me present what we call the charity principle. So what we're interested in doing is interpreting statements charitably, especially when we're talking about a controversial issue or a controversial argument. So there's kind of a pre-step here, which is deciding whether this is an argument or a claim that you actually should engage with at all. So there may be times when someone would say something that you find offensive or could be bigoted in some manner. And there's kind of a meta skill here, which is deciding perhaps as a teacher, perhaps as a student, whether you should even engage with an argument or a topic, right? And so I want to ask you guys about how you go about doing that in a second. But let's suppose that you have decided to engage with an argument or with a claim. The way that you want to do that is with what we call intellectual charity. So to get us in here, I'm going to demonstrate with an example. So here's this phrase, Black Lives Matter. So I don't know how you guys feel about this topic. Certainly, you may feel strongly about it, either positively or negatively, and certainly people feel strongly about it. So it's actually a claim, right? A statement that Black Lives Matter. Now, what I want you guys to notice is that there's more than one way that we can interpret this phrase. And I think a lot of the sort of acrimony related to some race issues in this country in particular can at least be partially traced to misunderstanding or misinterpreting, whether deliberately or not, what someone means by a statement like Black Lives Matter. Let me show you what I mean. So there's at least a couple of ways we could interpret the phrase Black Lives Matter. And an uncharitable interpretation could be something like Black lives matter more than other lives, right? So if I hear Aiden say Black Lives Matter and I interpret her as meaning that Black lives matter more than other lives, I'm probably being uncharitable to Aiden because, first of all, this claim isn't really plausible. It's not likely to be true. It's also not the kind of thing that most people mean by saying something like Black Lives Matter. So if you go ask, someone who says Black Lives Matter, what do you mean by that? It's very unlikely they actually mean that Black Lives Matter more than other lives, right? So that would be an uncharitable interpretation. On the other hand, a more charitable interpretation could be something like Black lives have been devalued throughout America's long history of racial injustice. Someone who says Black Lives Matter could mean more than that, but they probably mean at least something like that, right? So this is a more charitable interpretation because A, it's certainly more plausible. Like this is a true statement, right? Black lives have been devalued. It's also more consistent with the intentions of the average person who might say Black Lives Matter. Now, someone who says this might mean more than this, right? Like they might have an agenda they're trying to advance with the claim Black Lives Matter, but they mean at least this much probably. So to be charitable, we're looking for a statement that's likely to be true and is a modest statement rather than a more extreme claim. And when in doubt, by the way, one of the best moves in your charity toolkit is always just to ask someone what they mean, right? So if Aiden says, "Hey, Nate, just want you to know Black Lives Matter," instead of just guessing what she means, I could just ask her, "Could you clarify that?" I might notice that it could mean more than one thing, and when I'm not sure, you can always ask. Now, frequently when we're analyzing a text or someone says something on social media, or we're just looking at a document or primary source, we don't always have the benefit of asking what someone meant. But if we do have the opportunity, that's a great tool in our charity toolkit. So we teach students to ask what somebody means. Let me pause. Are there any questions so far or comments? Okay. So there's a few kind of moves that I just made here, and let me break them down for you, and then we'll do a couple more examples. One move is just, as I said, the pre-move that we don't even have in these slides is decide whether something is worth engaging with at all, right? Now, if you do decide to engage it, one move is to notice when a statement requires interpretation. A statement could need interpretation because it's potentially controversial or offensive, because it's vague or unclear what is meant, or because it's overstated or hyperbolic. So sometimes people will say things in more extreme ways, in kind of a clickbaity kind of way. And so we might need to rethink what they're saying in a more modest way, because if we took it literally, it would be kind of an absurd claim. So those are some reasons why we might need to be interpreting charitably. And then when we do interpret them, we're going to interpret them in the way that makes the most sense in context and is most likely to be true. And part of that means not committing authors to unnecessarily bold or controversial claims. So if you looked back here, the claim that Black lives matter more than other lives is an overly bold and controversial claim, right? Another example of an overly bold or controversial claim here could be something like, if I interpreted Black Lives Matter as saying like, racism is the cause of all other problems in American society, right? That's a much bolder and bigger and overstated interpretation of what someone means by Black Lives Matter, right? It's not a very modest interpretation, and therefore it's not very charitable. And choosing a more modest interpretation is what we're going for here. So I know it's a little kind of heady and abstract, so let me give you another example. Well, first, let's talk about why be charitable, right? One reason is you're more likely to believe true things because when you interpret other people charitably, you'll be more likely to have your own mistaken beliefs corrected. And you might learn something by talking to someone that you disagree with. People will like you if you listen carefully to them and try to give them the benefit of the doubt whenever you're interpreting what they say. And then along those lines, you'll also be more persuasive, right? Because people are more likely to have their minds changed when they can tell that you're actually listening to them. In the same manner that I'm sure none of you have ever been persuaded by someone who wasn't treating your argument thoughtfully. I sure haven't anyway. Okay, so here's a different claim that I'm sure you've all heard. All lives matter, right? So let's suppose that we see a sign like this, or we're talking to someone and they say something like this. Once again, notice that there's probably more than one way to interpret this phrase. And again, context is going to matter a lot, right? Because if Aiden says Black Lives Matter and I reply, all lives matter, that's in context, that could be seen as a sort of devaluation of what Aiden said or a negation of what she said, as if to say it's not true that Black Lives Matter or something like that, right? So context is really important. But let's suppose we just sort of see this kind of on the street, like this sign. This is your guys, this is the interactive portion. So I'm going to give you a few options and you can tell me what you think is the most charitable interpretation. One option is racism is not a significant problem in the US. One of them is we should value all lives equally, regardless of race. One option is every life counts equally, including the lives of plants and animals. And one option is we should support police. So what do you guys think is the most charitable interpretation of the phrase all lives matter? Go ahead and drop it in the chat. Okay, Gina says the second option. Karina says second. Anybody else? Julia says second. So does Faith. Melanie. All right. Seems like everyone is landing on the same place here, interpreting this as the second. So nice job, you guys. I thought about the same, that this would be the most charitable interpretation. Just to briefly walk through why I think this is the best answer, and hopefully you guys already did something like this when you were thinking about it. To say that racism is not a significant problem in the US is not a very plausible statement, and therefore it's sort of more extreme or more bold than we would want to attribute to someone who says all lives matter. Now, the statement that we should value all lives equally regardless of race is a very kind of plausible ethical ideal. It's something that you know, a lot of people could get on board with. And it's also more likely to be the kind of thing that someone actually means when they say something like all lives matter, if we want to give them the benefit of the doubt. To say that every life counts equally, including the lives of plants and animals, again, is sort of too extreme, right? So to say that plants' lives are equally as valuable as humans is it's packing way more into this statement than we need to, in a way that would make the speaker sound bad, right? And to say that we should support police, again, just kind of goes way beyond the scope of what all lives matter actually means. So someone who says all lives matter might also believe that we should support police, but if we're being charitable, we're trying to be very narrow in our interpretation. So we don't want to attribute that additional view to them unless they actually say it. All right. So I know it's kind of tricky, but you guys definitely nailed it with the most charitable interpretation for that one. So there's also just the step of noticing that something needs interpretation. So I'll read this argument for you guys and your job. And again, this is interactive, so please just drop it in the chat. Which statement in this argument requires charitable interpretation? Climate change contributes to many serious problems, such as food insecurity and increased natural disasters. People should make an effort to reduce their carbon footprint. Scientists have concluded that climate change is caused by humans. So one of these statements needs some interpretation. So go ahead and take a guess here. And thanks for being willing to just go for it. Okay. I see some folks asking for A or B. Great. So I'm wondering if anybody's willing to explain either in the chat or if you want to unmute yourself. Karina says C. Okay. Would anybody willing to explain why they think their statement requires charitable interpretation? Karina says sure.
Hi, Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. There's something wrong with the sound. I'm on my phone and it's just being very, very quiet. I misunderstood what you meant. I thought which was the one that required least, like you would already, that would be the charitable interpretation.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, that's why I was like, oh, that would be A. I thought that C because it's kind of, it's one of those things where it's very political. When we say that climate change is caused by humans, there's a whole side of the argument that believes that, you know, maybe climate change is happening, but humans are too insignificant to have a part in it, and we can't blame fossil fuels for that, or coal. So the one where it's blaming, assigning blame to human beings for causing the climate change, to me seems like the one that was more controversial.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks so much, Karina. I actually was inclined to agree with you here. So I thought that the claim that scientists have concluded that climate change is caused by humans is, first of all, potentially controversial, at least insofar as many people would be inclined to disagree. It's also not clear it's vague with regard to just scientists, like how many scientists, which scientists, it's unclear. And then finally, to say that they have concluded that climate change is caused by humans is a pretty strong statement. It suggests a certain amount of finality. It's not clear like where that finality would come from. So these exercises are a little tricky because you could find some ambiguity or things that need interpretation with A or B. But my eye would be drawn to C as the thing that make me squint and be like, oh, what do they mean by that? What do they mean have concluded? And so that's kind of what this question was asking, is like, where would you think people might be most likely to get tripped up reading this argument? So it's a good point someone said about B, that there's an assumption that people are already doing something or not doing something with regard to their carbon footprint. So in that sense, B might need some interpretation as well. Maybe saying like, if people aren't already making an effort to reduce their carbon footprint, they should do so. But in any case, I thought C needed a little interpretation. And so last little exercise, and then we can move on, is just to try to interpret the underlying statement. So once again, what's the most charitable interpretation here? So one more kind of interactive piece here. Here's some options for you. All scientists are 100% in agreement that climate change is caused by humans. Scientists believe that humans are the only cause of climate change. Most scientific studies show that climate change is caused by humans, or some scientists think global warming is caused by humans. So what do you think is the most charitable interpretation there? Well, okay, it looks like everyone said the fourth. Great. Julia said the third. Man, I wish we were all like sitting in a room together and we could get a little debate going here. Would anybody who said the fourth be willing to explain why? I don't know if you'll be able to kind of get your audio working, if Joe can unmute you or what have you, but I'd love if anybody's willing to explain why they thought the fourth is the most charitable. Okay, well, Faith says recognition of some scientific conclusion, not discounting. Sorry, Faith, I'm not quite sure exactly what you mean. Gina said she will, so yeah, Gina, go for it.
The reason that I selected the fourth was the first bullet. I'm looking at things being, totally conclusive. It says 100%.
Yeah.
The second one says scientists believe. They're like emphatic. Studies show that it's caused by humans, period. The fourth one uses not 100%. It says some, that seems to me most charitable. Some scientists think, as opposed to statements where it leaves little room for doubt. The fourth one is more charitable in that aspect.
Yeah, excellent. So thank you so much. So I definitely see what you mean about how, so the first one, hopefully everyone, like the first one just sounded way too extreme, because it's just very unlikely that all scientists are 100% in agreement about almost anything, right? Especially something like climate change. So it's just too extreme, right? All scientists 100%. So we can rule that one out. Now, the second statement, I think, sorry, Faith says not discounting, meaning not denying scientific evidence, not calling out of hand. Right. So I think I understand what you mean there, Faith. Just stop me, I guess, if I don't get to it here. The second statement, I think what's wrong with it is not so much to say that scientists believe something, but rather to say that humans are the only cause of climate change. I think that's probably too extreme, because scientists might identify a lot of other factors that are also contributing to climate change, right? So to say that humans are the only cause of climate change is actually a fairly extreme idea, at least in the sense that if you think about it, something as complicated as climate change, to say that humans are the only cause of it is actually really unlikely. So it's actually an overly bold statement. So that's why I thought it wasn't likely to be a good interpretation. Now, the reason that I thought it was 3 and not 4 is that we have the most versus the some. And I actually thought that to say that some scientists think global warming is caused by humans is the most modest, but I think it's actually too modest. So in other words, just to say that some scientists think global warming is caused by humans doesn't really tell, because that could just be a few, right? So it doesn't actually have enough force to support the argument. It's actually too modest. It's too sort of like gentle, right? And it's not actually extreme enough or bold enough. So because you need some force behind the statement in order to make it count as a reason in this argument. And so to say something like most scientific studies show is giving you sort of the right amount of oomph with your statement. Right, so Gina says, aren't we looking for the most charitable? That's right. So the most charitable doesn't necessarily mean the most modest, right? Because what we want to do is we want to actually assume that the author is trying to say something substantive. And to say that some scientists think global warming is caused by humans is saying something that is not very substantive, and therefore it's not charitable to attribute that claim to them, because it's hardly adding anything to the argument at all. So we want to give people modest claims that actually support their argument. Yeah. Yeah, and even to say that global warming, yeah, is as opposed to climate change, arguably is a kind of broader, more vague term. This is kind of tricky, right? So if you're kind of scratching your head, don't worry, it's okay. This is a tricky skill, and I'm actually really grateful to walk through this with you guys. I'm realizing maybe even these examples are perhaps a little too tricky, especially for, I don't know if any of you guys teach like 8th or 9th grade. So we are working on developing exercises that are more accessible for more learners. Before I hand it over to Aiden to introduce the Disagreement Project to you guys, I would love to know if you have any just feedback so far about these skills. And even if you're willing to, I'd love to know just like why you came to this webinar. Like you saw something about intellectual charity and you're like, oh, that's interesting. And it's, a lovely Wednesday afternoon. Why did you decide to join us, and what were you hoping to get out of the session? And, is this what you were looking for, or do we just totally miss the boat? I'd really love to know if anybody's willing to share. Great. So Gina says she and her husband are on opposite sides of the political spectrum. Right on. Well, points for making it work anyway. Honestly, that's America should learn something from you guys. Yeah. Faith asks, by saying most, don't we have to define the universe of scientific study on global warming? Right. So in order to, right. So if you wanted to be very precise about evaluating whether it was true that most scientific studies show this, you would have to say among the set of studies that have asked the question, how many of them, first of all, which studies are those? And then how many of them show that climate change is caused by humans? But yeah, I'd love to know anything else, just kind of like stepping back, what are you hoping to get out of learning about intellectual charity? And then are the kind of skills that we just sort of modeled and practiced in the right ballpark of what you're hoping to be able to teach your students to do? I'd love to know. Karina says, charity is something our kids need to learn. They're very quick to take offense. Actually, I think many Americans are. I want to understand as well as I can so I can teach it. 6th graders, wow. Very opinionated. So one thing that we've heard from teachers is that classroom discussions about certain topics, perhaps if you do decide to talk about something like Black Lives Matter or climate change, they can sort of devolve in several different ways. They could devolve because no one says anything and everyone's too afraid of saying the wrong thing, or they could devolve because people are kind of strongly opinionated and taking offense. Anybody else willing to chime in? Faith says, have we taught them to take offense quickly by offering absolutes? Faith, I'd love to know more about what you mean by offering them absolutes. If everybody wants to unmute yourself, just go for it.
Okay. Hi, this is Faith. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, excellent. So by absolutes, I'm talking about the fact that we are living in such a polarized society, not only in schools, but in homes and throughout social medias, the messages that we give. So it's either a for and an against. You're either on one end of the spectrum or the other end of the spectrum. And on my end of the spectrum is always right. The other end of the spectrum is always wrong.
Right. So we've got kind of the extreme polarization politically. And you might also worry that we've got a lot of what's called negative partisanship or negative polarization, which is, it's not so much that I'm really in favor of my side or my views as much as I am against the other side and their views.
Exactly. It's like, instead, we're back to I win, you lose scenario.
Very like zero sum kind of thinking.
Exactly. We're back to zero sum.
Mm-hmm. Did you see that a lot? Did you teach about the election and the lead up to the election?
Okay. Well, I've retired within the last year, but I've taught for close to 40 years. So I saw a whole, like the whole spectrum, especially, in the early 90s, everything was getting away from, zero sum models. It was like, mutual win scenarios. And of course, what we've seen, particularly in the last, let's just say 4 to 8 years in particular, we have just seen just your team versus our team. And especially amongst my middle school students, I could see, I believe it was Gina who was saying this, something very similar to Gina that she was seeing in her 6th grade, is that they're just absolutes. And those absolutes we needed to address as a school community, because, for example, if you wanted to put somebody down, you would just say, well, you're a liberal. I mean, and then you'd have other students saying you're a redneck, and so that those became very charged words in the community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I take it that you guys as educators feel it's your job to do something about this, which is awesome because we want to do something about it too. That's why we're trying to contribute our part here with the charity principle. Yeah, so Gina mentions that some districts have been instructed not to bring up current political situations, concerned about educational disruptions. And we heard this, and we've talked to educators in other states too, who were actually instructed not to discuss like the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, and those maybe other types of topics. We've heard that as well. I guess that strikes me as if we can't talk about it in school, where are we going to talk about it? Especially if we can't, like the future generation of our citizens, right? Like if we're not teaching them how to talk about that stuff with people who might disagree in our social studies classrooms, where are they going to get it? So that's my opinion. Not that you asked for it. Let's see here. I'm right. So Karina points out that we have to be neutral. Interesting dance to stay neutral. Totally feel that, Karina. We're in an interesting position here at ThinkerAnalytix because we're also trying to sort of offer resources, and we, whenever we touch a topic, we try to give arguments on both sides of the topic, and we try to be charitable to both sides, and sort of keep ourselves kind of neutral. But there's sort of two ways to be neutral. One way to be neutral is to totally ignore it and not say anything, right? And maybe a more difficult way to be neutral is to say, here's some good arguments on one side, here's some good arguments on the other side, and then trust students to be able to think through it for themselves and ask themselves, like, what's the best argument here? And to teach them how to do that. Yeah. So it looks like you guys are confident that it can be done. So I'm heartened by that. Keep after it. Awesome. So let's see. I know I've used a lot of time here already, so I apologize, Aiden. But really, we've it's actually heartening to know that you guys believe it can be done. Excellent. So I'm gonna stop sharing and hand it over. Oh wow, I used a lot of time. I'm so sorry. I'm gonna hand it over to Aiden to introduce you guys to something called the Disagreement Project, and then we'll let you get on your way.
Yeah, no, I think that was a really helpful introduction to this portion of the talk, because so we at ThinkerAnalytix think intellectual charity is really important. We also think it's a skill. So it's something that students can practice and practice and practice and get better at over time. And so a lot of what we do is work to provide, the resources that you need and the resources your students need to get that practice in the classroom or in Zoom, wherever you happen to be. And so what we're hoping to show you now is just a quick overview of a very concrete project that you could use with students at the middle or high school level to give them an opportunity to engage in a disagreement in a very sort of kind of structured way to practice these charity skills. So I'll share my screen. I just have a short set of slides that were actually put together by a Maine teacher who's an instructional coach with ThinkerAnalytix. Her name's Miriam and Mommy from Rangeley Lakes. And she was kind enough to put these slides together, and she actually used the Disagreement Project in her classroom this year. And let me make sure to have the chat open while I do this. Great. Okay, so this project is called the Disagreement Project. It originated with a friend and collaborator of ThinkerAnalytix, who's Javier Hidalgo, who's a professor at the University of Richmond. And we've sort of adapted this to be used at the K-12 level. So the Disagreement Project asks students to engage with a topic or a question that they feel strongly about. That's sort of the background. So here's a list of some questions that your students might have strong feelings about. So should schools have valedictorians, right? Should we go back to school in any form with COVID-19? I'm sure that's something you're probably actually sick of talking about at this point. Are zoos ethical? Miriam told us that that was like a really big, important topic for students in her class. And then some of them get more sort of political, right? Some of them, you know, or at least having to do with sort of political decision making. So things like, you know, should we pass a wealth tax, and things of that nature. So this is just a smattering of topics that students might sort of be able to latch onto as something that, you know, and say sort of like, yeah, that's something I have something to say about. That's something I have strong feelings about. And so the way the project works is it works in sort of stages. So in the first part, students are asked to find a partner and record a conversation about the chosen topic. And in particular, what they're asked to do is find a person who disagrees with them about the issue that they've chosen. So if you choose like, are zoos ethical, right? If a student chooses are zoos ethical, they need to identify a person who sort of feels differently about how to answer that question than they do. And the idea, what they're asked to do is not just sort of have a quick like text back and forth about it. They're asked to engage in a dialogue with this person that explores the disagreement. And in particular, try to pick out the reasons that each, in particular, the person, the other student, the student who's sort of being interviewed has for their view. So again, the student is asked to find someone they disagree with and sort of try to come to understand what that person's reasons are for their view. As you can see, you know, the conversation can be long. Sometimes people sit down thinking it'll be 10 or 15 minutes and it goes on for a long time because they feel strongly about these issues. But they're asked to record the conversation, and that's because the sort of reasons that are given in the conversation are going to be important for what comes next. All right, so far I'm not seeing any questions, so I'll keep moving forward. So that's part one, is just sort of like get the disagreement sort of on the table, get the other person's view on the table. You all sort of heard about this already, right? What part of what we're trying to get students to be practicing when they're listening to this other view is, you know, practicing the skills of intellectual charity, which involves, you know, humility, right? Being humble about the things that you believe, seeking the truth. So really trying to understand what it is the other person believes, and assume that they're also interested in seeking the truth, right? Assume that that's something that motivates them, and being open-minded, right? Being open to what other people kind of include in the arguments that they make, and being willing to change your mind if you find out something that you believe was mistaken. So just in the interest of time, I might not play these unless Nate, you think it's pretty important. But basically, so we have students record their conversations, and Miriam included at least some examples here. And then what they're asked to do is essentially write up the most charitable interpretation of that person's argument. So they need to write sort of in prose. Oops, what happened? Sorry, everybody. Write in prose what the other person really believes and what they said in the conversation. And that takes a lot of sort of, you know, checking yourself, self-regulation, sort of slowing down, really trying to understand the other person's view, because you're now the one needing to represent it, right? You're the one who's sort of charged with presenting it accurately. And here's where the sort of rubber hits the road. You then need to show your interpretation back to your partner and ask them to email your teacher or some other sort of checking mechanism to say, yes, this is my view. This is what I think. This person got it right. They understand my view. So there's a sort of like transparency there, right? It's sort of like everyone needs to be sort of working in good faith to understand each other's views, because at the end of the day, they're going to be checked, right? They're going to be checked by the person whose view it is. Sorry, something in the chat. Open-mindedness. Yeah, I know. Wouldn't it be a different world? I'm with you, Karina. So here's just an example of a student's summary. So as I said, a lot of our students seem to really latch onto this question about zoos. But you can see the student, it's not just sort of a, laundry list of like statements about zoos. Instead, they're listing reasons, right? The first reason I believe that zoos are ethical is da da da. And they go on to give multiple reasons. They even give some examples to support their view. So really, it is focusing on arguments. So giving reasons as opposed to just sort of, talking without a particular focus. Okay. Now, we will maybe point you to some resources about argument mapping at the end of this session. ThinkerAnalytix uses argument mapping, which is just a method for visualizing arguments as opposed to just writing them in prose, to teach charity, but also just to teach sort of logic and reasoning skills. In this case, Miriam asked the students in her class to not just write the prose summary of their partner's argument, but to map it, to sort of expose the reasoning and to really dive into that reasoning at a deeper level. And that's something we have resources that we will point you to if that's something of interest to you as well. You could also just have students stick with just the prose summary. And then what they're asked to do is evaluate their peers' argument. So at this point, right, if I'm a student who's doing this project, I've interviewed my partner, I've really dug into the recording, I've written a thorough summary of their reasoning, and now I can, they agree that this is their view, right? They've checked it. And now I can confidently say like, okay, I've understood it, now let's evaluate it. Now I can sort of offer a response. I can try to figure out where it is I disagree and why. And I'll just say here again, Miriam is referring to MindMap, which is just a software tool for visualizing arguments. You need not do that, right? This could again just be in prose. So all of this can be used just with the standard tools that you're already using in your classroom. Okay, I will pause there and ask if there are any questions. I know I just threw a lot at you. Talking about having students write about why they support their argument. Telling students the Supreme Court, in his opinion, is a branch of most admired. Right, yeah, exactly. Thanks, Gina. Yeah, so the idea is that, so one of the things we also talk about when we talk about arguments is, arguments are sort of what make democracy, right? That's we make arguments to each other rather than being sort of falling to I don't know, something like violence or something terrible like that. Yeah, so certainly giving reasons and giving arguments is at the center of democracy for sure. And Nate, I think that was all I had. I want to make sure you have time to finish up.
No, I think that's all we had for you guys for now. So I dropped a link to the slides that Aiden was just showing you in the chat. And I'm also gonna give Joe my slides that I was doing earlier when we were looking at the examples from Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. And the plug for you guys is if you want to learn more, maybe I'll drop my email address in the chat here as well. And we'd love to send you, we have a workbook that we're drafting to just give students more practice with these skills. And if you want to become a, did the link not show up for you guys? Okay, yeah, Aiden just pasted it again. Okay. Great, sorry about that. Okay, I see you guys are able to see the slides now. Excellent. So we're also working on a workbook that is going to kind of teach students these skills. And we'd love if you want to kind of give us comments and feedback on it. Please just reach out to me in my email address. And then if you want a deeper dive, we're also partnering this summer with a Harvard Graduate School of Education to produce a course for teachers. So it's about 3 weeks long, about 15 hours total. So you can kind of take it asynchronously That's offered again through the Harvard Graduate School of Education. So I see Gina and Karina would like the workbook. If you guys want to email me, that'll probably be the best way for us to make sure you get access to the workbook and can make some comments on it. My email is in the chat. So I just dropped the link to the course that we're offering in partnership with the Harvard Grad School of Education. And if that's something that interests you, we'd love to have you guys join for that as well. My email address apparently isn't coming through either. Can you guys see that? Oh, it's because I'm only talking to the panelists. Whoopsie. Okay. I'm so sorry, you guys. Well, there's Aiden's. And here's mine. Sorry about that. Okay, then let me drop the link again to the Hugsy course.
You were on such a roll of saying it's in the chat. I was like, I'm going to kind of just let him go a little bit. Let's see how many things he drops into the chat.
Not very
Evil
charitable,
Joe.
Joe.
That's what I always say. The main educators are always so nice. I said at the beginning, right? It's kind of a beta test thing, like give some feedback. And I always promise very thoughtful, polite participants who are willing to just roll with whatever we have. So I appreciate everybody's like, nope, still not in there yet.
Very kind of you guys. Yeah, so totally email us and we'll make sure you get the workbook on charity. And like I said, I'll make sure that you guys get the slides that you saw today as well, so you can do these activities with your students. Glad you guys enjoyed at least this portion of it, and we'd love to explore more with you. The other thing we'd love your feedback on, either just in the last 2 minutes that we have, or shoot me an email, or however, we just want to know like that kind of first step of like, how do you decide whether to engage an argument? Like if you guys have any rules of thumb that you use or that you give to your students, right? Just even deciding whether to engage in a discussion or whether to analyze an argument. If you have any like guidance on that, we'd love to know. Just because we're literally working on that in our workbook and we want to say something useful. So.
Does anybody have any questions for Nate? And I see people are dropping in responses to Nate's latest question. Does anybody have any questions for Nate while we still have him here?
Yeah, I see you guys saying that it's very relational, knowing your students and building relationships with them. That definitely matches my experience as well. Rapport, yeah.
All right, well, at this point, if there's no additional questions, I will give you my formal thank you, Nate and Aiden. So thank you for spending an hour of your time sharing your expertise with us today.
Yeah, so glad you could have us in.
Thank
Great to be
you.
here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.